Hey guys, before tonight's journey begins, take a moment to settle in. Find the position your body wants to rest in. Loosen anything that feels tight. Let your shoulders drop and let the day you have carried begin to set itself down. Tonight we are spending a quiet year inside the life of one unmarried woman in Regency England, following her through the seasons of a stone cottage beside a lake, from the first flowers of spring to the return of snow. There is nothing here you need to follow closely. The story moves at the pace of breathing, and it is meant to carry you gently towards sleep. If these quiet journeys help you rest, you are warmly welcome to follow the channel, so that another evening like this one can find you when you need it. A quiet like, or a few words left below about where you are listening from tonight, helps others discover these stories too. There is no hurry to do any of it. It can wait until morning, or it can wait forever. None of it asks anything of you now. For now, there is only this, the warmth around you, the slow settling of the night, a long, gentle story waiting to begin. So let your eyes close if they wish to. Let your breathing slow. And when you are ready, we will step through a low doorway into a small stone cottage where the fire has just been lit. There is a cottage in the north of England, tucked against the side of a hill where the grass runs down to the edge of a lake. It is a small place, the walls are stone, the roof is slate, the garden is barely wider than a man could stretch his arms across, and the front door is so low that most visitors have to duck their heads to get inside. In the spring of 1800, a woman walked through that door for the first time. She carried almost nothing with her. She had no husband, no children, no income of her own to speak of. She was not famous, she was not beautiful in the way that got you painted or written about. She was 30 years old, and she had come here to live with her brother, a poet who had not yet written the poems that would make his name. And on her first evening alone in this cottage, after her brother had left for Yorkshire, with cold pork wrapped in paper in his pocket, she sat on a stone beside the lake and cried until her chest loosened. Then she dried her face, walked home through a wood full of wild strawberry flowers, and sat down at the kitchen table. She opened a notebook, and she began to write, not poetry, not letters to important people, just the day. What the light looked like on the water, how the sheep gathered together on the slopes after rain, the sound a sheep bell makes in a hollow, which she called exquisitely soothing, the exact colour of the sky at 6:15. She wrote it all down in a hand that slanted to the right, in sentences that had no vanity in them, only a quality of looking so closely at the world that the world seemed to lean in and hold still for her. She would keep this journal for years. She would fill it with bread making and moonlight, with the names of every flower that bloomed in her garden and every stranger she met on the road. She would mend her brother's shirts and copy out his poems and walk miles in the rain to collect a letter that had not yet arrived. She would lie on a mossy rock and fall asleep for 10 minutes and wake with her headache gone. She would watch the breezes on the lake spread outward, like a peacock's tail, and then die away. And she would sit there long after dark, unable to drag herself home. She never married. She never published a book. When her brother became the most celebrated poet in England, she remained in the back room, copying his lines into clean manuscripts, feeding him mutton chops in bed when he was too tired to come downstairs. And yet she left behind something that none of the famous men around her quite managed. She left behind the days themselves. The actual weight and weather of ordinary life, set down so gently that you can still feel the cold of the stone she sat on and the warmth of the fire she came home to, more than 200 years later. Tonight, we are going to step inside those days. We are going to follow her through 1 year in that cottage, from the planting of the first peas to the return of the snow. We are going to watch her bake bread and pull weeds, and walk for miles under a moon that she described better than any poet alive. There is nothing dramatic waiting for us. No crisis, no scandal, no revelation. Only the life of a woman who found, without anyone noticing, a way to be complete. Let us go to her then. The door is low, and the fire is lit, and the lake outside is perfectly still. The lake is perfectly still when she arrives. It's May, and the valley has that look about it that comes only in late spring in the north of England, when the green is so new and so deep that it almost hurts to look at. The ashes haven't leafed out yet. The oaks are just beginning. But the grass along the shore is thick and soft, and the air smells of wet earth and something faintly sweet that she can't quite name, though she'll spend the next 3 years trying to find words for it in her journal. Her name is Dorothy Wordsworth. She's 29 years old. She has dark eyes, a long face, a way of walking that people notice because it's quick and eager, almost boyish. She's come to this valley with her brother William, who is 30, and who writes poetry that almost nobody has read. They've taken a small cottage at the southern end of Grasmere, a place called Town End, though later it'll be known by a different name. The rent is £5 a year. The front door is so low you have to bow your head to enter, as though the house itself were asking for a small act of humility before it had let you in. And tonight, if you don't mind, I'd like to take you inside, not to see anything grand, not to witness any turning point in history, just to stand beside this woman in her doorway for a moment, and to watch the way she looks at things. Because the way Dorothy Wordsworth looked at things is something I keep coming back to, and I think it might be the quietest form of genius I've ever encountered. The cottage sits with its back against the hill and its face toward the road that runs along the edge of the lake. It's a modest place, built from the grey-green stone that seems to grow out of the ground in this part of the world, the same stone the sheep walls are made of, the same stone the old bridges are made of, so that the house looks less like something that was built and more like something that was always here. 2 rooms downstairs, 2 rooms up. The floors are flagstone, cold underfoot in every season. The kind of cold that seeps through your stockings in January and makes you walk a little faster toward the fire. The windows are small, set deep into the thick walls, and they frame the world outside like pictures hung in a gallery that nobody curated on purpose. One window gives you the road and the lake beyond it. Another gives you the orchard climbing the hill behind the house. The ceilings are low enough, that a tall man would feel them pressing down. But when you step inside and the fire's been lit, and the kettle's beginning to hum, and there's bread cooling on the table, the smallness of the place stops being a limitation and becomes something else entirely. It becomes closeness, warmth held tight, a room that knows exactly how much space 1 or 2 people actually need. There's a kitchen at the back where Dorothy does most of her work, with a stone hearth wide enough to swing a pot over the coals and a window that looks out onto the garden wall. The smoke from the chimney doesn't always draw cleanly. When the wind blows from certain quarters, the room fills with it, and she and William have to leave and sit outside until the air clears. There's a small parlour at the front where William reads and writes, and where the books are kept, stacked along the windowsill and piled in the corners. Upstairs, the bedrooms are barely large enough for a bed and a chair, but from the upper window you can see clear across the lake to the fells on the far side. And on still mornings the mountains sit reflected in the water as though the whole world has been folded in half. And outside, running along the front of the cottage, there's a strip of garden. It's not much, just a narrow bed between the house wall and a low stone boundary, barely wider than a dining table. But Dorothy will turn this strip of earth into something remarkable. Behind the cottage, climbing up the hillside, there's an orchard, a few apple trees and a couple of damson plums that won't fruit reliably, but that she loves anyway for the way they blossom in April. Their branches throwing white petals down on the grass where she'll sit with her sewing in the afternoons. She'll plant that garden with everything she can get her hands on. Honeysuckle trained around the yew tree by the gate, French beans along the sunny wall, London pride and lemon thyme and wild columbine dug up from the rocks above the church. Snowdrops that she transplants in February, pressing them into the half-frozen ground with her bare fingers. Foxgloves from the dell. Privet slips set in the damp soil on a cold evening. She gets her plants from the blind man's nursery down the road, from neighbours' gardens, from the hedgerows she passes on her daily walks. She carries them home in her apron, in baskets, in her arms. One afternoon she gathers so many that she has to leave the basket sitting in the middle of the road and send the girl Molly back to fetch it for her. I think about that sometimes. A woman so hungry for growing things that she literally can't carry them all home. There's something in that image that tells you nearly everything you need to know about Dorothy Wordsworth, She didn't want to observe the world from a distance. She wanted to pick it up and bring it inside and put it on the windowsill where she could see it while she worked. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Let's go back to the beginning. To that first day, the 14th of May, 1800, when William and his brother John set off after dinner for Yorkshire, with cold pork in their pockets, and Dorothy walked with them as far as the bay at Lowood, under the trees, and couldn't speak when she kissed William goodbye because her heart was too full. She's alone now. She sits on a stone at the edge of the lake for a long time, and she cries. Not delicately, not poetically. A flood of tears, she writes, and you believe her? Because Dorothy never exaggerated anything in her life. The lake looks dull and melancholy to her. The waves sound heavy against the shore. Everything around her is beautiful in that way the Lake District is always beautiful. The mountains soft with afternoon light, the water catching it and turning it silver, and she can't bear any of it, because the person she loves most in the world has just disappeared down the road with cold pork and a change of stockings. If you'd been standing on the shore that afternoon, watching this thin woman in a plain dress, weeping quietly on a rock, you might have thought she was someone in trouble, someone without resources, and in the most literal sense, you'd have been right. Dorothy Wordsworth had almost nothing. No money of her own, no property, no profession, no title, no particular standing in the world. She'd spent most of her 20s being passed between relatives, living in other people's houses, fitting herself into the corners of other people's lives. Their parents had both died when she and William were children. She was 6 when her mother passed. Their father followed a few years later, and the 5 Wordsworth children were scattered among uncles and grandparents, separated from one another for years at a stretch. The longing to be reunited with William, to have a home they shared, had become the central fact of Dorothy's emotional life. She had carried that wish through a decade of other people's spare bedrooms. Now, finally, they had a cottage of their own, and he'd left on the first day. But here's the thing about Dorothy. She didn't sit on that rock forever. She sat until the pressure in her chest eased, and then she stood up, wiped her face, and walked home. She walked along the shore, noting the stones under her feet. She walked through the wood and saw the wild flowers, the thick yellow ranunculus, the strawberry blossoms, the orchises growing in pairs. She met an old man driving a beautiful bull and a cow walking with 2 sticks, and she watched him pass. She came through the village of Rydal and was irritated by the fine new houses that spoiled the view. And by the time she reached the cottage, she'd already begun the work that would define the rest of her life. She'd begun to look. That evening she sat down and wrote the first entry in her journal. She set some slips of privet in the garden. The evening was cold. She lit a fire. Her face turned flame-coloured from the heat. It was 9 o'clock. She went to bed wishing she had a letter from William. There's no drama in those lines. No beautiful phrasing, no reaching for effect. Just a woman recording the plain sequence of her evening. The privet, the cold, the fire, the colour of her own face, the time, the wish. And yet something about the way she sets those things down one after another, with equal weight given to each, makes you feel like you're standing in the room with her. You can feel the heat of the fire on one side of your face. You can see the privet cuttings in the jar of water on the sill. You can feel the particular loneliness of a house that's warm enough but missing the one person who makes it home. She resolved, she wrote, to keep a journal of the time, until William and John returned, because she would not quarrel with herself, and because it would give William pleasure when he came home again. I love the honesty of that. She tells you her 2 reasons, one practical, one tender, and neither of them has anything to do with literature or legacy. She's writing to keep herself steady. She's writing because it'll make someone she loves happy. That's all. That's enough. In those first days alone, she fell into a rhythm that would hold for years. She rose early before the sun had fully cleared the fells. She walked. Sometimes just to the garden wall, sometimes around the whole lake, sometimes all the way to Ambleside and back. A journey of several miles each way along a road that wound between stone walls and hedgerows thick with hawthorn. She came home and worked. She read Shakespeare in the afternoons, sitting under the trees when the weather was fine. One day it was Midsummer Night's Dream. Another day, Timon of Athens. She sauntered in the garden between chapters, pulling a weed here, pressing a cutting into the soil there, talking to no one, answerable to nothing but the next task and the failing light. On Sundays, she walked to the little church across the valley. One morning, a girl from Coniston came to the cottage door to beg. The child had slept outdoors all night. Her stepmother had turned her out. Dorothy listened and gave her what she could and wrote it down. On another morning, a woman from the village stopped her on the road, well dressed and respectable, and asked for a halfpenny. She'd never begged before, the woman said, but these were hard times. Dorothy recorded these encounters with the same steady attention she gave to the primroses and the clouds. She didn't moralize, she didn't pity from a height. She simply noted who had come to her door, what they'd said, what their faces looked like. And then she went back to her mending. She'd go on writing like this for years, every day, or nearly every day, in a hand that slanted to the right across the page. She wrote about the weather almost always, because in the Lake District the weather isn't background, it's the main event. She wrote about what she cooked, and what she mended, and what she planted. She wrote about the birds she heard, and the flowers she picked, and the colour of the lake at different hours. She wrote about the people she met on the roads, the beggars and the peddlers and the old women selling thread and mustard. And she wrote about William, what he was working on, whether he slept well, whether he tired himself out with composition and had to lie down on the floor after dinner, with his mattress pulled out and a book he was too restless to read. There's a way of reading Dorothy's journal that makes it sound like she lived entirely for her brother. And it's true that William is at the centre of almost every entry. She copies his poems, she walks with him, she reads to him when he can't sleep. She lies awake worrying about him when he's away. But I don't think that's the whole picture, and I want to be careful about this because it matters. What you notice if you read her journal slowly, day by day, the way it was written, is that Dorothy had a life of her own happening. Alongside all that devotion, she had her garden, she had her walks, she had her eye, which was extraordinary, more precise and more patient than any eye in English letters. She had her own responses to beauty that weren't borrowed from anyone. When she lay on her back in the orchard and watched the birds flutter about beneath the trees, pecking blossoms and bits of moss from the branches, she wasn't waiting for William to come and tell her what it meant. She was having her own experience of the afternoon. She was fully alive, in her own right, in her own body, on her own patch of grass, and the journal itself was hers. She never intended it for publication. She never showed it to critics or editors. She wrote it partly to give William pleasure when he came home, partly to keep herself company in the long quiet hours, and partly, I think, because she simply couldn't help it. The world came at her so vividly, so constantly, that writing it down was the only way to keep from being overwhelmed by it. A sunset wasn't just beautiful to Dorothy, it was specific. It had a colour she needed to pin down, a quality of light she needed to trap in words before it shifted. The lake wasn't just calm, it was calm in a particular way, with particular breezes moving across it in patterns she could see from the shore, spreading outward like feathers or the tail of a peacock, then dying away to nothing. Every day brought her 100 things that needed to be recorded, and she recorded them with the same careful attention whether she was happy or heartbroken, whether the sun was shining or the rain hadn't stopped for a week. This is the woman we're going to spend the night with. Not a saint, not a martyr, not a footnote in someone else's biography. A woman who made a life out of the ordinary materials available to her, stone and water and earth and sky, and made it so thoroughly that 2 centuries later you can still feel the texture of her days underneath your fingers. She didn't know any of that, of course. She didn't know that anyone would ever read her journal. She didn't know that the poems her brother was struggling to write in the front parlour would one day be considered among the greatest in the language, or that scholars would trace his most famous lines back to her quiet prose. She didn't know that the daffodils she'd described one wet April afternoon by the edge of a lake would become the most recognised image in English poetry. She knew none of it. She knew that there were snowdrops to plant. She knew that the bread needed baking and the shirts needed mending. She knew that if she walked to Ambleside before the post arrived, she'd have wasted the trip, and she'd have to go again in the evening. She knew that the fire needed feeding, and that the chimney smoked when the wind came from the east, and that if she sat in the orchard with her sewing after dinner, the light would last until nearly 9. And the thrush in the ash tree at the top of the garden would still be singing. The cottage is quiet now. The fire has settled into its embers, and the stones of the hearth are holding their warmth the way they always do, slowly, grudgingly, giving it back to the room through the long hours of the night. Outside, the lake is holding the last grey light of the sky, and somewhere across the water a sheep bell is ringing, very faintly, in a hollow between 2 hills. Dorothy has closed her journal and set it on the table beside the candle. She's gone to bed. Tomorrow she'll rise early and start again. She'll walk to the lake before breakfast. She'll notice what the mist is doing on the mountains, and whether the snowdrops have pushed any further through the soil. She'll write it down, and we'll be there beside her, watching her world take shape, one quiet day at a time. Let's begin with an ordinary morning. Not a special one. Not a morning when anything happened. Just a day like most of her days, the kind she recorded in 3 or 4 plain lines that turn out, when you sit with them, to hold an entire way of living. She wakes early. The light is coming grey through the small window, and the flagstones are cold under her feet as she crosses the room. Downstairs, the fire from the night before has died to a few faint coals. Her first job before anything else is to bring it back to life. She kneels at the hearth and feeds it small sticks first, the ones she and William gathered on their walks, then the larger pieces, blowing gently until the flame catches and climbs. The peat smokes. The kitchen fills slowly with warmth, and only then, with the fire going and the kettle set over it, does the day properly begin. I want to stay with this fire for a moment, because it's easy to pass over, and it shouldn't be. In Dorothy's world, warmth was not something you summoned by turning a dial. It was something you built by hand every single day, and rebuilt every time it failed. The sticks had to be gathered, often on the same walks where she noticed the moonlight and the sheep. The coals had to be coaxed. The chimney, as we've said, didn't always cooperate, and when the wind was wrong, the smoke came back down into the room and drove her and William out into the cold to wait. A fire was the labour, it was attention. It was a relationship you kept up with, day after day, and it gave back exactly as much as you put in. There's an entry later that winter that has stayed with me. William is away. Dorothy sits up late writing letters by a little peat fire, and the fire grows smaller and smaller as she writes, and she doesn't dare go into the pantry for more fuel because she's afraid of waking her brother, who's finally asleep. So she writes on, and she gets colder and colder, until at last she goes to bed at 2 a.m, starved with cold, gathering every scrap of clothing she can find to pile over herself, and even then she can't sleep. I never felt such a cold night, she writes. There's no complaint in it. She simply records the cold as she recorded everything, precisely without drama. But when you read it, you feel it in your own bones. The dying fire, the dark pantry she won't enter, the heap of clothes that isn't enough, the particular loneliness of being cold in a house where someone you love is sleeping warm. But this morning is a summer morning, and the fire is only for the kettle and the bread. So let's move on to the bread. Dorothy baked, not occasionally, not as a hobby, but as one of the fixed labours of her week. Bread and pies. She writes it down again and again, almost in passing, tucked between the weather and the walks. I baked bread. I baked pies and bread in the morning. She made the dough, kneaded it, set it to rise near the warmth of the fire, shaped it and baked it in the oven beside the hearth. On the days she baked, the whole cottage would have smelled of it. That deep, plain, comforting smell that hasn't changed in 200 years and won't change in 200 more. And here's something I find quietly moving. There's a day when she's alone, and she lists what she's eaten. 2 boiled eggs and 2 apple tarts. That's her dinner. She made the tarts herself, of course. A woman on her own in a stone cottage, baking apple tarts for a solitary meal, then sitting down to eat them by the window. There's no self-pity in the entry. If anything, there's a kind of contentment. She's fed herself. She's done it with her own hands from what she had. And she's noted it down the way she noted everything as a small fact worth keeping. After the baking, there's the mending. This is perhaps the labour that appears most often in her journal, and the one that's easiest for us to underestimate. She mended William's shirts. She made shirts from scratch, sitting on the wall in the evening light, stitching until she could no longer see. She made shifts, the plain linen undergarments that everyone wore. She made a shoe, and then made another shoe, over the course of several days, a task she returned to again and again in odd moments. She bound carpets. She darned old clothes. When the carpet needed cleaning, it had to be taken up and shaken and beaten, and the girl Molly would do the heavy work, and Dorothy would note with a kind of warmth how happy Molly was in her work, exulting in her own importance. Think about what this means. Every piece of clothing in that house was maintained by hand. Nothing was thrown away when it tore. It was mended. A shirt might be repaired a dozen times before it finally gave out. A pair of stockings was darned and re-darned. The making of a single shirt took hours of careful stitching, and Dorothy did this work in the margins of her days, in the last of the evening light, sitting on a wall or by the fire, her needle moving steadily while her mind, I imagine, wandered wherever it liked. And this is the thing about her days that I keep turning over. The work was endless. It genuinely never stopped. There was always bread to bake, always a shirt to mend, always the fire to keep, always the garden to tend, always water to carry, and floors to sweep and linen to wash and dry. A modern reader might look at a life like this and see only drudgery, only a woman worn down by unending domestic labour with no reward and no recognition. But that's not what comes through in the journal. What comes through is something much stranger and more beautiful. Dorothy seems to have found in the very repetition of these tasks not a prison but a kind of peace. The work gave shape to her days. It rooted her in the physical world, in the actual textures of dough and linen and soil and flame. And crucially, it never crowded out her looking. She could iron all day and still notice and write down that there was a purplish light on Mr. Oliph's house that made her turn and see a strange stormy mist coming down the side of Silver How, a mist the colour of reddish purple. She could bake bread and shell peas and mend a shoe, and in the same entry described the exact way the breezes moved across the surface of the lake. The labour and the looking weren't in competition. They were woven together. Her hands were busy, and because her hands were busy, her eyes and her mind were free to roam. There's a wisdom in that arrangement that I don't think she ever articulated, because she didn't need to. She just lived it. Consider the laundry, which was one of the great labours of any household in her time. Washing linen was not a matter of an hour. It was a heavy, wet, physical business, involving hot water and soap and a great deal of wringing and lifting. And then the drying, which in the damp climate of the lakes was its own difficulty. Dorothy writes of spreading out the linen, of hanging it out, of drying it in the morning when the air was still cold. She writes of starching and hanging out linen on a bright day, of the whole business of getting a household's cloth clean and dry and put away. It was hard work. It roughened the hands, and yet she folds it into her record without complaint, one more thread in the fabric of the day, alongside the peas she pulled and the letter she wrote and the walk she took in the evening. And there's the water, which we forget about entirely now, because it comes to us through pipes at the turn of a handle. For Dorothy it came from a well or a spring or the beck that ran down the hillside, and every drop that entered the house entered it because someone carried it in. Water for the kettle, water for washing, water for cooking, for cleaning, for the plants in dry weather. She writes of watering the garden in the evening, of watering plants by moonlight after she'd set them in the ground. Watering a garden by moonlight, bucket by bucket, is not a thing anyone does unless the plants matter to them more than their own tiredness. And to Dorothy, the plants always mattered. She kept the garden the way she kept everything, with a mixture of hard labour and pure delight. She sowed French beans and kidney beans and spinach. She stuck the peas, which meant pushing in the tall twiggy sticks the pea plants would climb, a fiddly patient job she did over and over through the growing season. She planted broccoli. She weeded. She transplanted things from one bed to another, from the hedgerow to the border, from the rocks above the church to the strip of earth in front of her door. When a plant died, she felt it. When one thrived, she noted it with quiet pride. She once uprooted a strawberry blossom on her impulse and immediately felt as if she'd committed an outrage. so she planted it again and wrote that it would have a stormy life of it, but let it live if it can. That's the sentence of a woman who saw a single flower as a life with its own stake in the world. I keep coming back to a particular quality in her, which is that she was almost never bored. That astonishes me. Here is a life that, described from the outside, sounds like it might be crushingly monotonous. The same small cottage, the same handful of neighbours, the same tasks over and over, season after season. And yet Dorothy's journal is one of the least bored documents in all of English writing. Every day is full. Every day something is seen, something is noticed, something is worth setting down. The monotony that would flatten most of us simply didn't exist for her because she was paying attention. And attention, it turns out, is the enemy of boredom. If you look closely enough at anything, it stops being ordinary. There's a detail I love from the depths of one winter. Dorothy notes, almost in passing, that Thomas Ashburner had brought them their 8th cart of coals since the 17th of May. 8 cartloads of coal to get a household through from spring to the edge of winter. She counted them, not because she was anxious particularly, but because in her world you kept track of such things. Fuel was survival. The carts of coal, the gathered sticks, the stacked peat. These were the difference between a warm house and a cold one. And Dorothy, who noticed everything, noticed them. When you read that she and William gathered a burthen of large rotten boughs blown down by the wind of the preceding night, you're watching two people turn a storm's damage into next week's warmth. Nothing was wasted. A fallen branch was not debris, it was fire, waiting to be carried home, and I think this is part of why her days feel so full rather than so hard. Everything was connected. The walk that gathered the sticks was the same walk that saw the moon. The storm that broke the boughs was the same storm she described so beautifully, the trees almost roaring, the ground seeming to move with the multitudes of dancing leaves. The labour and the beauty came from the same source, which was simply being awake and outdoors and paying attention in a world that asked a great deal of you and gave a great deal back. There's the girl Molly Ashburner, who came to help with the heavier work, and whom Dorothy watched with real tenderness. Molly had known hard times before she came to the cottage, and she was so happy in her situation there that she once said something to Dorothy that Dorothy couldn't forget. Talking of her good luck in being in the house, Molly said that those who were now dead and gone would have been proud creatures if they could have seen where she was now, compared to what they had feared her fate would be. Dorothy set it down, that plain and moving expression, the way she set down everything, and in doing so she saved a servant girl's single sentence from the total silence that swallowed almost every voice like Molly's. We know Molly existed, and we know she was grateful, and we know the exact shape of her gratitude, only because Dorothy thought it worth writing down. That's a small thing, but it's the kind of small thing Dorothy did constantly, and it adds up to something large. She was a keeper of the ordinary. In a world that recorded kings and battles and the doings of great men, she recorded the servant girl's happiness, the apple tarts, the smoking chimney, the mended shoe. She gave weight to the things that history throws away, and because she did, we can still see them. There were the meals to think about too, beyond the bread. Dorothy cooked what the season and the valley provided. In summer there were the peas she grew, which she pulled by the basketful, some for the table and some sent off to neighbours by whatever cart happened to be passing. There were the pikes the men caught in the lake, boiled and roasted, a fish so plentiful in those waters that a single day's fishing might bring in 2 or 3. There were the gooseberries she walked up the hill to gather at Mr. Simpson's, and the apples she pulled from the orchard in autumn, a large basketful at a time. There was mutton, and there were eggs, which she fetched from the coombe or received as a gift from a neighbour, along with a jug of milk. She made tarts. She broiled a mutton chop for Coleridge one night and carried it up to him in bed, where he ate it propped against the pillows. The kitchen was the engine of the house, and Dorothy ran it, and somehow, in the running of it, she was never too busy to look up and see what the light was doing. I think there's a lesson in that, though Dorothy would never have called it a lesson. It's this. A life can be almost entirely made of small, repeated, physical tasks and still be rich. still be full of wonder, still be worth recording day after day for years. We tend to think that meaning has to come from large things, from achievements and events and milestones. But Dorothy's journal quietly insists on the opposite. Meaning was in the bread. It was in the mended shoe, the watered plant, the counted cart of coal. It was in the doing of ordinary things with a whole and attentive heart. She never argued for this, she just proved it. One plain entry at a time. By the time the day is ending, she's done a dozen things and named none of them as important. The bread is baked and cooling. The mending is done, or as done as mending ever is. The fire is banked for the night. Outside, the summer light is finally going, and she carries her sewing out to the wall to catch the last of it, stitching until the thread and the needle blur together in the dusk. A neighbour passes. A bird sings somewhere in the ash tree. The lake goes still. She'll write it all down before she sleeps, not because she thinks it matters, because looking at it and setting it in words is simply how she lives. The work of the hands, all day. And then, at the end, the work of the eye and the pen, gathering the day up and holding it so that it won't be entirely lost. The candle is low, and the wax has pooled and hardened around its base. The stitching is finished. She sets down her needle, smooths the cloth across her lap one last time, and closes her journal. And the cottage settles into the dark, holding its warmth for the night. If there's one thing Dorothy did more than any other, more than baking, more than mending, more even than writing, it was walking. She walked almost every day of her life. She walked in the morning before breakfast and in the evening after dinner. She walked to fetch letters and to deliver them, to visit neighbours and to escape them, to see the moon come up and to watch the mist come down. She walked in sunshine, in rain, in wind that nearly took her off her feet, in snow that filled her shoes. She walked distances that would tire most people today, 10 miles, 12 more, over rough mountain roads, and thought nothing of it and came home and did a day's work besides. And I want to be careful to say what this walking was and what it was not. It was not exercise in the way we mean the word. She didn't walk to burn energy or to keep her figure or to hit some number of steps. It wasn't a chore either, though it often had a purpose. Walking was simply how Dorothy moved through the world. And more than that, it was how she saw the world. On foot, at the pace of a body moving over ground, she noticed things that a person in a carriage would fly straight past. And noticing, as we've seen, was the great business of her life. So let's go with her. Let's take one of those evening walks, the kind she took 1,000 times, and see what there is to see. It's evening, and the day's work is done. She puts on her cloak because even in summer the air off the mountains turns cool once the sun drops behind the fells. She steps out through the low door and onto the road, and immediately the world begins to offer itself to her. The first thing is the light. Dorothy was endlessly, inexhaustibly attentive to light. She noticed the way the setting sun laid a band of gold along the top of a hill, while the valley below fell into shadow. She noticed the strange greenish colour the sky sometimes took after rain. She noticed how, on certain evenings, the light seemed to come from the ground itself, from the pale road and the pale water, rather than from the sky. She once described the lake as glittering with the light of the moon, and another time as being like a dark mirror holding the shapes of the hills upside down. Light was never just light to her. It had a temperature, a mood, a particular quality that belonged to that hour and no other, and she chased it with words the way a painter chases it with a brush. Then there's the sound. This is something we lose almost entirely now, living as we do inside a permanent hum of engines and machines. Dorothy walked in a world that was, by our standards, almost completely silent. And against that silence, every sound stood out sharp and clear. The bleating of sheep on the hillside, the particular music of a sheep bell in a hollow, which she called exquisitely soothing, a sound so soft and so distant that you had to be paying attention to catch it at all. The roar of a waterfall after heavy rain, the wind in the trees, birdsong which she knew intimately, the different voices of thrush and robin and cuckoo and owl, and, on the stillest nights, sounds that seemed to come from impossibly far away, the murmur of a distant stream, the barking of a dog 3 valleys over. There's a moment in her journal I've never forgotten. It's winter, and she's out walking, and everything is quiet, and she writes that she could hear the sea. The sea from Grasmere is many miles away, over several ranges of hills. You cannot normally hear it. But on this particular still winter night, with the birds silent and the insects gone and all the small busy sounds of summer stripped away, the sound of the distant sea could reach her. She writes that in winter you can hear the roar of the sea, because the noise which lives in the air of summer is gone, that the air itself has a sound in the warm months, a kind of living hum made of 1,000 tiny voices, and only when all of that falls silent in the cold can the deeper, further sounds come through. I find that almost unbearably beautiful, the idea that summer has a sound so constant we stop hearing it, and that its absence in winter is what lets us hear the sea. Only someone who had walked and listened for years in every season could have noticed a thing like that. Consider the moon, which was one of Dorothy's great companions. She walked by moonlight often, and she watched the moon the way some people watch the sea, endlessly, never tiring of it, always finding something new. She noticed the moon riding high and small and white among fast-moving clouds. She noticed it hanging huge and orange low over the fells. She noticed the way it laid a path of broken light across the water, and the way that path seemed to follow her as she walked along the shore. One night she and William stood together and watched the moon and a single star, and the sky behind the mountains was of a solemn dark blue. And the moon stood there, she wrote, like a visitor come to see them from another world. She had a gift for making the moon feel personal, present, almost like a face turned toward her in the dark, and she was not afraid of the dark, which strikes me every time I read her. A woman alone, walking mountain roads at 10 and 11 at night, in an age with no streetlights, no help within miles, and she walks on, calm, attentive, gathering the beauty of it. Once, she describes going out at night to post a letter and finding the darkness so complete and so soft that she stood a while just to be inside it. There's a fearlessness in her relationship with the night that I think came from long familiarity. She had walked these roads so many times, in every kind of weather and every quality of dark, that the night was not a threat to her. It was simply another face of the world she loved, and she went out to meet it the way you'd go out to meet an old friend. Now she is further along the road, and here is a beggar coming toward her, or a family of travelling folk, or an old man bent nearly double under a pack. Dorothy meets these people constantly on her walks, and she never looks away. We'll spend a whole night with them later, the people on the road, because they deserve it. For now, I'll only say that Dorothy's walks were not solitary communions with nature, sealed off from humanity. They were threaded through with encounters. A woman begging who had never begged before, a tall beggar with a coat held together by a leather girdle, a group of children gathering sticks, a pair of lovers she passed without disturbing. The road was a living thing, and she walked it with her eyes open to all of it, the flowers and the people alike. But let's come back to the flowers, because the flowers are where Dorothy's attention reaches something close to genius. She did not see flowers the way most of us see them, as a pleasant general mass of colour. She saw each one. She knew their names, and where they grew, and when they bloomed, and how they changed through the season. Walking, she catalogued them without effort, the way you or I might notice the shops on a familiar street. The wild strawberry blossom, the wood sorrel, the celandine, which she loved and watched with real devotion, noticing how it closed up before rain and opened again in the sun. The primrose, the foxglove, the wild columbine growing out of bare rock, the orchis, the daisy, which she called the cheerful, homely thing, and to which she and William both felt a kind of loyalty. The weather, too, never kept her in. This is one of the things that most separates her walking from ours. We wait for fine days. Dorothy walked through everything. She walked in rain so hard it soaked her to the skin, and wrote about the beauty of the wet woods afterward. She walked in wind so violent she could barely stand, and described the way it flung the rain against her and roared in the trees and set the whole lake heaving. She walked in snow, following the print of her own feet from the morning, watching the way the flakes settled on the black branches and the grey stones. She walked in the thick clinging mist that swallowed the mountain whole, and turned the familiar road strange. Every kind of weather was to her a different version of the world, and she wanted to see them all. A grey, wet, blustering day was not a day wasted indoors. It was a day with its own particular beauty, its own colours and sounds and moods, and she went out into it gladly, and came home wet and cold and full. I think there's something we could learn from that, though I say it gently, because I don't want to turn Dorothy into a lesson. But there is a freedom in her refusal to wait for perfect conditions. She didn't postpone her life until the weather improved. She lived it in the rain and the wind and the cold and found those things beautiful, and so her world was never shut down, never on hold. Every single day was available to her, because she had decided that every single day was worth walking into. There were the trees too, which she knew as individuals, not trees in the abstract, but this oak, that ash, the fir grove on the hill, the single tall tree that stood against the sky at a particular bend in the road. She noticed when the leaves came and when they fell. She noticed the winter branches bare and black against a pale sky, and the way the new green of spring came so gradually you could almost miss it if you weren't watching, and Dorothy was always watching. There's an entry where she describes sitting under a tree and looking up through the branches at the sky, and the way the light came down through the moving leaves. And I think she could have sat there for an hour, perfectly content, watching nothing but the leaves and the light. She had that capacity which so few of us keep past childhood, to be completely absorbed in something small and ordinary, to give it her whole attention and ask nothing more of the afternoon. And the birds, she knew their songs and their silences, when the cuckoo first called in spring and when the swallows came back to build under the eaves, which they did one year right outside her window, so that she watched the whole slow business of the nest going up, day by day, a little more each morning. She wrote about those swallows with a tenderness that catches in the throat, following their labour as closely as she followed her own, until one day the nest fell and she felt the loss of it. Two small birds' broken work, as keenly as if it had been her own. But let's come back to the flowers, because the flowers are where Dorothy's attention reaches something close to genius. And here I have to tell you about the daffodils, because it happened on a walk and because it's the most famous thing to come out of all this looking, though Dorothy didn't know that when she wrote it. It was the 15th of April, 1802, a wet, wild day. Dorothy and William were walking home along the shore of a lake called Ullswater, in the teeth of a cold wind, when they came upon a few daffodils growing near the water's edge, and then a few more, and then, as they walked on, a long belt of them, stretching along the shore under the trees, more daffodils than either of them had ever seen. Dorothy stopped and looked, and that evening, or soon after, she wrote it down. I won't give you her exact words because they're hers, and you should read them yourself one day, but I'll tell you what she saw in my own words. She saw that the daffodils grew among the mossy stones at the water's edge. She saw that some of them, tired, rested their heads on the stones as if on pillows, and she saw that the rest of them tossed and reeled and danced in the wind coming off the lake, and that they seemed, all of them together, to be genuinely laughing with the wind, so full of glad life were they. That's what she saw, a crowd of flowers in a gale, looking for all the world as though they were dancing for joy. 2 years later, her brother William sat down and wrote a poem about those daffodils. It begins with a man wandering lonely as a cloud, and it ends with him lying on his couch remembering the flowers and feeling his heart fill with pleasure and dance with them. It is today perhaps the single most famous short poem in the English language. School children memorize it. It has been printed millions of times, and its central image, the crowd of daffodils dancing by the water, came directly from what Dorothy saw on that walk and set down in her journal 2 years before William turned it into verse. I want to sit with that for a moment, because it tells us something important, and I'll come back to it properly later. For now, just hold this. The most famous nature poem in English began as a woman's ordinary journal entry about a walk in bad weather. She wasn't trying to write literature. She was just doing what she always did, looking hard at the world and putting down what she saw. And what she saw was so true and so alive that it became immortal, even though her own name stayed off the page. The walk goes on. The light is nearly gone now. She turns back toward home, and the cottage window is a small warm square of candlelight ahead of her in the blue dusk. Her feet are wet, most likely. Her cloak is damp. She's walked several miles and seen 100 things, and she's tired in the good way, the way that comes from a body well used and a mind well fed. And this, night after night, year after year, was Dorothy's true wealth. She owned no carriage. She had no money for grand tours or fashionable resorts, but she had her own 2 feet, and the roads of one of the most beautiful valleys on earth, and eyes that never stopped seeing. She could walk out her own front door and, within a mile, encounter more beauty than most wealthy people saw in a lifetime of travel. And she knew it. That's the thing. She knew exactly how rich she was, in the only currency that mattered to her. There's a way of walking that we've almost forgotten. Walking with nowhere particular to be and no particular hurry to get there. Walking slowly enough to see the small things, the wet spider's web strung with light, the single early primrose in a sheltered bank, the way the wind moves through a field of grass in visible waves. Dorothy walked that way every day of her life. And her journal is, among many other things, a record of what that kind of walking gives you. Not fitness, not efficiency, something quieter and rarer. A whole world delivered to you free, one step at a time, for as long as your legs will carry you and your eyes will stay open. She's home now. She lifts the latch and steps into the warmth. The fire is low but living. She hangs her damp cloak by the hearth, and she sits down and she reaches for her journal, and she begins to write down the walk, so that it won't be lost. The moon, the sheep bell, the daffodils if it was that kind of day, the wet road home, outside the dark comes down over the valley, and the lake holds the last of the light. And somewhere far off, if it's winter and the air is still, you might just be able to hear the sea. Summer has come to the valley now, and with it a softness that changes everything about the days. The mornings are warm before Dorothy is even out of bed, and the light comes long and golden into the evenings, so that she can sit in the orchard with her sewing until nearly 9 and still have enough of it to see by. The garden she planted in the cold months has come into its own, the beans climbing their sticks, the flowers she carried home in her apron now blooming in their borders, and the whole small world around the cottage is thick with crowing things, humming with bees and heavy with the particular sweetness of a northern summer that everyone in that country knows will not last, and treasures all the more because of it. I want to spend this chapter in the 2 places that gave Dorothy the most pleasure in these warm months, and where some of her happiest hours were spent. The orchard behind the cottage, climbing the hillside among the apple trees, and the lake, wide and still, that lay just across the road from her door. These were her summer rooms, in a sense, the outdoor spaces where she lived when the weather allowed it, and the journal fills in the summer months with the quiet contentment of a woman who has everything she needs within 100 yards of her own front step. Let's begin in the orchard, because that was Dorothy's favourite place in all the world, I think, and the place she returns to again and again in her writing with the most obvious love. It was a steep little slope of grass planted with fruit trees, apples mostly, and a few plums, running up the hill behind the house. There was a mossy stone she liked to sit on, and higher up, kind of natural seat among the rocks where she and William would go to be quiet together. And the whole place had a sheltered secret quality to it, held between the house below and the fell above, private and green and full of the sound of birds. She'd go up into the orchard after the morning's work was done, carrying her book or her sewing, and she'd settle herself on the grass or the mossy stone, and she'd simply be there, in the warm shade of the trees, for as long as the day allowed. Sometimes she read, sometimes she sewed. Often she did neither, and simply lay on her back in the grass and looked up. There's an entry where she describes lying in the orchard and watching the birds come and go among the branches above her. Small birds, fluttering and pecking at the blossoms and the bits of moss. So close and so unbothered by her stillness that she felt herself to be almost one of them. A quiet creature among quiet creatures, taking her ease in the green shade of an afternoon. I love that image of her more than almost any other, because it shows you what she had learned to do, which so few of us can do at all. She could be perfectly still and perfectly content doing nothing whatsoever for a long stretch of time. She didn't need to be entertained. She didn't need to be productive every waking minute. She could lie in the grass and watch the birds and let the afternoon pass over her like water, and count that time not as wasted, but as some of the richest she had. And here is a small thing that has always stayed with me. She writes once of lying down on the grass in the orchard when a bad headache had come on, and closing her eyes, and falling asleep for perhaps 10 minutes in the open air, and waking to find the headache gone, cured by nothing more than rest and grass and the warmth of the day. There's a kind of wisdom of the body in that, an easy trust in simple remedies that I think we have mostly lost. The birds and animals of the orchard came to know her, in the way that wild things come to know a person who sits still and means them no harm. There's one entry I always come back to, from a summer afternoon, when Dorothy was lying quietly in the orchard, and a young lamb wandered in through the gap in the wall. The lamb came closer and closer, curious, unafraid, until it was standing quite near to her, looking at her with that blank, gentle, faintly foolish expression that lambs have. And Dorothy lay absolutely still, not wanting to frighten it, holding her breath almost so that the small creature would stay. And it did stay. It stood there and looked at her for a long time, the woman and the lamb regarding one another in the summer stillness, before at last it took fright at something, some sound or movement, and bounded away up the hill. She wrote it down, of course. A tiny nothing of an event. A lamb that came near and then ran off. And yet, set down in her plain and patient prose, it becomes one of the loveliest small moments in the whole journal, a perfect little emblem of the kind of life she led, quiet enough and gentle enough that a wild lamb would come and stand beside her. There were the fruits of the orchard too, which were part of the pleasure of the place. The apple trees that blossomed white in the spring bore their fruit through the summer and into autumn, and Dorothy would go up and gather them when they were ready, a great basketful at a time, carrying them down to the house to be stored and eaten and baked into the tarts she loved. The plums, when they came, were a smaller and less reliable harvest, but all the more prized for that. And even the blossom itself was a kind of harvest to her, the way it came in April, and covered the trees in white and then fell, drifting down onto the grass where she sat so that she'd look up from her book and find the air full of slowly falling petals, and the ground around her white with them, as though it had snowed in the middle of spring. There was a particular pleasure Dorothy took in giving away what the garden and the orchard produced, and it tells you something about how she lived among her neighbours. When the peas came ripe in such quantity that she and William couldn't possibly eat them all, she'd gather a great basketful and send them off to Mrs. Simpson, or to the Clarksons, or to whoever had a cart going that way, a gift of fresh peas pulled that same morning, still cool from the vine. When the apples were more than they could store, she shared them. When someone up the valley was ill or in want, something from the cottage garden would find its way to their door. This was not charity in the grand, distant sense. It was the ordinary neighbourliness of a place where everyone lived close to the edge of what the land could give, and where a good crop was understood to be a thing you shared, because next season the shortfall might be yours. Dorothy moved easily in that web of small kindnesses, giving and receiving, a basket of peas going out and a jug of milk or a dish of gooseberries coming back. The whole valley bound together by these quiet exchanges of what the earth provided. And I find something deeply restful in that picture of a life so woven into a single place. Dorothy knew her few square miles of valley with an intimacy almost impossible for us to imagine now. She knew which bank the first primroses would show on, and which pool held the biggest pike, and whose orchard the best plums grew in, and where along the shore the daffodils would come. She knew the people too, the Simpsons and the Ashburners, and the old people in the cottages, their histories and their troubles and their small daily doings. She was not a visitor to this landscape, passing through and admiring it. She belonged to it, as thoroughly as the trees belonged to it, and it belonged to her. And out of that long, deep belonging came the astonishing closeness of her seeing. But let's leave the orchard now and cross the road to the lake, because the lake was the other great presence in Dorothy's summer. and in some ways the greater of the two. It was there when she woke and there when she slept, filling the view from her windows, changing its face 100 times a day with the light and the weather and the wind. And in summer, when the water was warm enough and the evenings long enough, it became a place not just to look at but to be on. And some of Dorothy's happiest hours were spent out on its surface in a small boat as the day cooled toward night. They fished the lake, William especially, for the pike that lived in its waters in great numbers. Pike are big fish and hungry, and the men of the valley caught them in quantity, and a good day's fishing might bring home 2 or 3 of them, enough to feed the household for days. There's an entry where William catches a pike of 7.5 pounds, a real monster of a fish, and you can feel the modest triumph in the way Dorothy records it. The pleasure of a good catch, of food secured, of a small victory on an ordinary afternoon. The fish would be brought home and cleaned and boiled or roasted and eaten with the vegetables from the garden and the bread from the oven. A whole meal drawn almost entirely from the 100 yards of world around their door. The heat of the day, when it came, was a thing to be managed and enjoyed in equal measure. On the warmest afternoons, Dorothy and William would seek out the shade, retreating into the cool green dimness under the trees, or down to the water's edge, where the air off the lake carried a freshness even at noon. She writes of hot days when they lay in the shade unable to do anything but rest, the whole valley drowsing in the heat, the birds gone quiet, the water flat and glaring under the high sun. And she writes of the relief of evening, when the heat broke at last and a coolness came up off the lake, and the world seemed to sigh and stir and come back to life for the long golden hours before dark. There's a rhythm to a hot summer day in her writing, the slow, drowsy weight of the afternoon giving way to the ease and beauty of the evening that anyone who has spent a summer in the country will recognise at once. And that hasn't changed one particle in 200 years. It strikes me, reading these summer entries, how much of her happiness came from things that cost nothing at all. The shade of a tree on a hot day, the coolness of evening after heat, a basket of peas, the sight of a lamb, an hour lying in the grass watching the birds. She had almost no money, as we have said, and yet her summers were rich beyond measure, full to the brim with pleasure and beauty and quiet contentment, because the things that gave her joy were the things that any person with open eyes and a little stillness could have for free. There's a kind of wealth in that which no amount of money can buy, and which Dorothy possessed as fully as anyone who has ever lived. The evenings on the lake are where Dorothy's writing about the water reaches its most beautiful. She and William would take the boat out as the sun was going down, rowing slowly across the still surface, and the world would go quiet and golden, and then blue around them. She writes of the lake in the evening lying perfectly calm like a sheet of glass, so smooth and so still that it held the reflection of the mountains upside down, a whole second valley hanging beneath the real one in the water. She writes of the strange, lovely effect of the breezes that would come across the surface now and then, ruffling the glass, spreading outward in a widening fan of ripples, which she compared to the spreading of a peacock's tail, and then dying away again to leave the water still as before. She had watched those breezes on the water 1,000 times, and still they caught her. Still she reached for a new way to describe the old familiar miracle of wind moving over a lake at dusk. And here is the moment I love best of all, from one of those evenings on the water. It is nearly dark. The boat is drifting on the still lake, and above them the sky is deepening toward night, and somewhere high overhead a raven flies across, croaking as ravens do, that harsh, dry, unlovely sound. And then something happens that Dorothy caught, and that only Dorothy would have thought to catch. The raven's croak goes up into the air, and it strikes the wall of the mountains that ring the lake, and it comes back. The sound returns to them off the fells, an echo, so that the single bird's cry seems to be answered from the heights, one harsh note thrown out into the dusk, and one thrown back, like a bell answering a birdom, no? She writes of how the sound of the raven was returned to them by the rocks, a hollow, resounding echo rolling round the mountains in the still evening air. And there's something in that image, the bird and the mountains calling back and forth across the darkening water, that seems to me to hold the whole spirit of her life. A small ordinary sound, a vast, still listening world. And one woman, out on the water in the last of the light, awake enough to notice the conversation between them and to save it, so that 200 years later we can hear the raven too. The boat comes in at last. They pull it up onto the shore and walk back across the road to the cottage, where the fire is waiting and the pike is to be cooked and the long summer day is finally, reluctantly, giving itself up to the dark. Dorothy is tired and happy, in the particular way that a whole day spent out of doors makes you tired and happy together. She has been in the orchard and on the lake. She has watched a lamb and heard a raven. She has gathered apples and caught the light on the water. And now, before she sleeps, she will sit down at the table and gather all of it up into words. The orchard and the lake, the lamb and the raven, the peacock breezes and the 7-pound pike, so that this one summer day, which nobody would ever have thought to remember, is kept. And there were the visitors, for the cottage was never entirely solitary, and summer brought its share of company to the door. Coleridge would come over the hills from his own house, arriving sometimes late and unexpected, and the three of them would sit up talking into the small hours, the poets and Dorothy, the conversation flowing on long after the candles had burned low. Neighbours would call, friends would walk over from the next valley, and Dorothy, who so loved her quiet and her solitude, loved this too, in its season, the warmth of good company on a summer evening, the talk and the laughter, the sense of a house that was small but never closed, a hearth that could always make room for one more. She fed them what the garden gave, and she listened, and she watched, and later, when they'd gone and the house was quiet again, she'd set down who had come and what had passed, the visits woven into the record of the days alongside the peas and the pike and the falling blossom. The candle burns down. Outside, the lake she loves lies still and dark under the first stars, holding the shapes of the mountains in its black glass. And in the small stone cottage on its shore, a woman closes her journal on another day, and the orchard sleeps above the house, and the fruit ripens slowly in the dark. Tonight I want to take you away from the cottage and out onto the roads, because the roads were where Dorothy met the people that history has almost entirely forgotten, and because the way she saw them and wrote them down is one of the quietest and most remarkable things about her. You have to understand what the roads of England were like in her time. They were full of people on foot, not travellers in the modern sense with tickets and destinations, but a whole floating population of the poor and the wandering, moving from place to place in search of work or food or shelter, or simply because they'd nowhere to stay and nowhere to be. There were peddlers carrying their wares from village to village. There were old soldiers and sailors discharged from wars and left to make their own way home across a country that had little use for them. There were beggars of every kind, some who had begged all their lives and some who had come to it late and were ashamed. There were whole families on the move, the children barefoot, the parents carrying everything they owned on their backs. The road was their home, and it was a hard one, and most of the comfortable people of the age looked straight through them, as though they weren't there at all. Dorothy didn't look through them, she looked at them, and she wrote them down one by one, with the same careful, unhurried attention she gave to the daffodils and the moonlight. And because she did, a handful of these vanished people, who would otherwise have left no trace whatsoever on the earth, are still here, still visible 200 years later, held in the amber of her plain prose. Let me introduce you to a few of them. There was the leech gatherer, though she didn't call him that. He was an old man she and William met on the road one day, very old, bent nearly double with age and labour, so that his body was bowed almost into a circle, his head coming down toward his feet. He walked with the help of 2 sticks, and when they stopped and spoke with him, they learnt that he made his living, such as it was, by gathering leeches from the ponds and marshes, wading in the cold water to collect the small creatures that doctors still used for bleeding their patients. It was a miserable trade, and a failing one. He told them that leeches had once been plentiful, and he had been able to gather them easily and sell them well, but that now they'd grown scarce and the work grew harder every year, and his own body was failing him. He'd once, he said, been able to get a good price, but times had changed, and now he could barely make a living at all. And yet, Dorothy noted, he spoke of his hardships without bitterness, in a quiet, steady, dignified way, an old man near the end of a hard life, still walking the roads, still wading the cold ponds, still going on. William was so struck by this old man that he later made him the subject of one of his poems, a poem about resolution and independence, about the strange strength of a human being who keeps going against every discouragement. But it was Dorothy who met him first and saw him first and wrote him down first. The bent old body, the 2 sticks, the failing trade, the quiet dignity. There was a family of travelling people they met on another day, and this encounter Dorothy set down with a novelist's eye for detail. The mother was a tall woman, striking with a kind of wild handsomeness to her, and she walked ahead while the children came behind. And one of the children, a boy, had decorated his ragged hat with a sprig of green leaves, a bit of foxglove or laurel, some small green thing picked from the hedge, worn like a feather in his cap, a scrap of beauty and pride on a child who owned almost nothing in the world. Dorothy noticed that. Of all the details she might have recorded about a poor travelling family, she noticed the green leaves in the boy's hat, the small human wish to adorn oneself, to be fine, that survives even in the deepest poverty. And she noticed, too, when the family story didn't quite hold together, when the account they gave of themselves seemed designed to draw sympathy and coins, and she recorded that as well, without judgment, simply as part of what she saw. They were quick, she observed, quick to sense an advantage and quick to be gone, darting away when they thought they might be caught in a tale, fast as a flash of lightning. She saw them whole, not as objects of pity, not as noble innocents, but as real and complicated people doing what they had to do to survive. There was an old soldier too, one of many she met, discharged from the army after long service and making his slow way on foot towards some place he called home, though whether anyone waited for him there he didn't say. He was tall and worn, and his coat, which had once been a proper coat, was held together at the waist by nothing more than a leather strap, a girdle of the kind a labourer might wear, cinching the ragged cloth around a body gone thin with hard walking and short rations. Dorothy noticed the leather girdle the way she noticed the green leaves in the boy's hat, the small telling detail that made the whole man real. He spoke quietly, she wrote, without complaint, telling his story in a plain, steady voice as though it were someone else's story, as though he'd walked so far past his own suffering that he could look back on it now with a kind of calm. She gave him what she had, and she watched him go on down the road. One more old soldier among the thousands the wars had used up and thrown away, and she carried his face home with her and set it down. There was a sailor she met, a man named in her journal as coming from the sea who had lived a life so hard it is difficult to take in. He'd served on a slave ship, that terrible trade that hung over the whole age, and the horror of it had marked him. He'd been at sea for years, in conditions of brutality and danger, and now, discharged and adrift, his great fear was of being taken up again by the press gangs, the men who roamed the ports and roads seizing sailors by force to serve in the navy, whether they willed it or not. He told Dorothy that he had sooner face any fate than be pressed back into that life, that he hadn't slept properly in days for fear of it, that he was walking and walking to stay ahead of it. And Dorothy, listening, was struck by something that had nothing to do with his troubles and everything to do with her own heart. She thought he looked like her brother, not William, but their brother John, the sailor of the family, away at sea himself, whom she loved and worried over constantly. This stranger on the road, this broken, frightened man fleeing the press gangs, reminded her so strongly of her own absent brother that she could hardly bear to look at him and could hardly bear to look away. That is the thing about Dorothy. She couldn't keep the world at a safe distance. When she met a suffering stranger, she saw her own brother's face, and the suffering became real to her and personal and impossible to forget. There were the beggars who came to the cottage door itself, for the poor knew which houses might give and which would turn them away, and Dorothy's door was known to be one of the kinder ones. A woman came once, respectably dressed, not ragged at all, and asked, with obvious shame, for a halfpenny. She had never begged before in her life, she said, and you could see that it was true, that some sudden misfortune had brought her to this, The loss of a husband perhaps, or a home, and that the asking cost her more than the halfpenny could ever be worth. Dorothy gave her what she could and wrote it down. The respectable woman brought low, the shame in her face, the strangeness of watching someone cross the line from one kind of life into another. Another time it was a young girl from a village some miles off, who had slept out of doors the whole of the night before, turned out by a stepmother who didn't want her, wandering the roads with nowhere to go. Dorothy took her in for a little while and fed her, and listened to her story and set it down. A child sleeping in the open, unwanted, walking. It is the kind of small human tragedy that must have happened 10,000 times in that age and left almost no record anywhere. But this one child left a record because she happened to knock at Dorothy's door, and Dorothy happened to be a person who wrote things down. And this is what strikes me most when I gather up all these encounters and hold them together. Dorothy never sentimentalized these people, and she never despised them either. She didn't weep over them in her journal, and she didn't lecture about them, and she didn't use them to make herself feel virtuous. She simply recorded them, exactly as she recorded the weather and the flowers, as part of the true texture of the world she lived in. A beggar was as real to her as a primrose, and as worthy of careful attention. That evenness of regard, that refusal to look away or to look down, seems to me a rarer and finer thing than any amount of showy compassion. She gave these people the one thing almost no one else gave them. She gave them her full and equal attention. It helps to remember why the roads were so crowded with the desperate in those particular years. England was at war, and had been for a long time, and war has a way of grinding up the poor and scattering them across the countryside. Prices were high. Bread was dear. The old ways of the villages, where a poor family might at least have had a patch of common land to graze a cow or gather fuel, were being closed off and enclosed, fenced in and taken for private use, so that the people who had depended on them were left with nothing and took to the roads. Soldiers and sailors came home from the fighting to find no work and no welcome. And over all of it hung the press gangs, and the workhouse, and the constant low terror of falling one step further into ruin. This was the world Dorothy walked through on her way to fetch the post. The beauty of the valley, which she loved so dearly and described so well, was laid over a great deal of human suffering, and she knew it, and she did not pretend otherwise. Her journal holds both, the daffodils and the leech gatherer, the still lake at evening and the frightened sailor. She saw that the world was beautiful and that it was cruel both at once, and she had the strength and the honesty to keep her eyes open to the whole of it. I find myself wondering sometimes what these people would make of it if they could know that a poor woman they passed on a road one day and spoke to for a few minutes and then never saw again had carried their faces home and written them into a book that would outlast every great name of their age. The leech gatherer never knew he would become a poem. The boy with the leaves in his hat never knew that his small vanity would be remembered 2 centuries after his death. The frightened sailor walked off into the dark and vanished from history entirely, except for the few lines Dorothy gave him, which are now the only proof that he ever lived at all. There is something almost unbearably moving in that, when you sit with it. These were the most forgettable people in the world by every measure their age applied, and they are remembered when kings and generals of the same years have faded to dust, because one woman with no power and no fame decided that they were worth looking at. I have to pause here, because I think this is the heart of what made her who she was. Dorothy had no power to fix any of this. She couldn't end poverty, or stop the press gangs, or bring the leeches back to the ponds, or find homes for the wandering families. She was herself a poor woman, with barely enough to keep her own small household going. What she could do, the only thing she could do, was to see these people, to stop on the road and speak with them, and look at them properly, and then to go home and write them down so that they would not vanish completely. It is a small thing, seeing. It changes nothing, saves no one, fills no empty stomach, and yet there is something in it that I find almost holy. In an age that looked away, Dorothy looked. In a world that forgot these people the instant they passed, Dorothy remembered. And because of that, they are not entirely lost. The old leech gatherer still walks his road. The boy still wears his green leaves. The frightened sailor still turns his face, and it is still, somehow, the face of a brother. Now I must tell you about one more thing that happened in the valley, and I will tell it gently because it was a sad thing, and Dorothy recorded it with great tenderness, and it deserves to be handled with care. There was a woman of the valley who came to a sorrowful end. The circumstances were unhappy, as such things often are, tangled up with a marriage that hadn't been kind and a life that had grown too heavy to carry. She was lost to the water, one dark time, and the valley grieved for her in the way that small close communities do, gathering together to see her decently to her rest. And on the day she was carried to the churchyard, Dorothy watched the small procession make its way, the plain dark coffin freshly painted, the neighbours walking behind. And what Dorothy noticed, what she chose to set down, was not the sadness of it, or not only the sadness. It was the strange, piercing beauty of the churchyard on that particular day. The grass so green in the sunlight, greener and more alive than she'd ever seen it, so that the place of rest seemed, in that moment, more full of life, and more touched with something like holiness than anywhere else on earth. She wrote that the green grass of the churchyard looked lovely, more solemn and more human than she had words for. She held the sorrow and the beauty together, the loss of this one poor woman and the green grass shining over her, and she didn't flinch from either. And then she went home, and the valley went on, and the seasons turned, and the grass grew, as it always does, over everything. I have thought about that entry many times, about the way Dorothy could look at the hardest things in life, the poverty, the fear, the sorrow, the losses, and neither look away from them nor be destroyed by them. She simply saw them, and held them, and set them down, and let the green grass grow over them in her prose, as it grew over them in the world. There is a strength in that which is very quiet and very deep. It is the strength of a person who has decided to keep her eyes open, come what may, and to bear witness to the whole of life, the beauty and the sorrow both, because both are true and both deserve to be seen. The road is empty now. The travellers have passed on to wherever they were going, the old leech gatherer to his ponds, the family to the next village, the sailor to whatever became of him, which we will never know. The churchyard is quiet under its green grass, and Dorothy is home again, at her table, with her journal open and her candle lit, writing down the people of the road, one by one, so that they will not be entirely forgotten. She doesn't know that she's doing anything important. She thinks she's only keeping a record of her days, but she's doing one of the kindest things a human being can do for another. She's refusing to let them disappear. The candle gutters. The last of the light goes from the window, and somewhere out on the dark roads of England, the wanderers walk on unseen by everyone in the world except one woman, in a small stone cottage, who saw them and remembered. We have come now to the part of Dorothy's life that I find the most quietly astonishing of all, and the hardest to hold in the mind without a kind of ache. It is the story of her writing and her brother's writing and the strange, tangled, beautiful way the two were woven together, so that it becomes almost impossible to say where hers ended and his began. And it is the story of how one of them became famous, celebrated, studied, remembered by the whole world, while the other remained invisible, in the back room, copying out the fair manuscripts in her slanting hand and asking for nothing. Let me try to describe how they worked, these two, in that small cottage, because it was unlike anything most of us have ever seen. William was a poet, but he didn't write the way we imagine poets writing, alone at a desk with a pen. He composed out loud, on the move, walking. He'd pace back and forth along a particular gravel path, or stride out across the fells for hours, muttering, humming, working the lines over and over in his mouth until they came right, and only then would they be written down. And often it wasn't William who wrote them down, it was Dorothy. He'd come in from a walk with a poem half made in his head, and she'd take it from his lips and set it on the page, and then copy it out clean, and then copy it again when he changed it, which he did endlessly, obsifla, revising the same short poem 12 times, 20 times, wearing himself and her to exhaustion over the placement of a single word. She was his secretary in a sense, but that word is far too cold for what she actually was. She was his first reader, his memory, his sounding board, his tireless copyist. When his eyes troubled him, which they often did, she read to him for hours. When he couldn't sleep, she sat up with him. When he tired himself into illness with the labour of composition, and he genuinely made himself ill with it, headaches, exhaustion, a kind of nervous collapse, she nursed him and fed him, and kept the household running around the fragile, difficult, precious work of his mind. There is entry after entry in her journal that reads, in essence, William working at his poem, William tired, William unwell, William unable to eat, and always underneath, Dorothy there, holding it all together so that the poems could get written. And here is the thing that changes everything. The thing that makes this more than the familiar old story of a woman serving a great man. Dorothy wasn't just the support system for William's genius. She was, in a real and demonstrable way, a source of it. Because William didn't only take dictation from his sister, he took vision. He took her eyes and her observations and the very words she'd written in her private journal, and he made poems out of them. I have to be careful here, and precise, because this matters and it's easy to overstate. William was a great poet in his own right. The music of his verse, the philosophy in it, the shaping intelligence, those were his. But the raw material, the actual seen things, the images at the heart of some of his most famous poems, those again and again came from Dorothy. She'd see something on a walk and describe it in her journal that night, in her plain, exact, loving prose. And months later, sometimes years later, William would reach into that journal, or into his memory of what she'd shown him, and build a poem on the foundation she'd laid. The clearest case of all, the one that still takes my breath away, is the daffodils. You know the poem, even if you think you don't. It is the one where the speaker drifts alone through the hills like a small cloud, and comes all at once upon a great crowd of golden flowers by the edge of a lake, under the trees, fluttering and tossing in the wind. It is, quite possibly, the most famous short poem in the entire English language. It has been memorised by more schoolchildren than any other. And its beating heart, the image of the crowd of daffodils dancing by the water, did not begin with William at all. It began with Dorothy, on a wet and windy walk, 2 years before he wrote a single line of the poem. I told you about that walk earlier, but let me bring you back to it now and stay a little longer. It was April, and it was blowing hard and cold, and the two of them were walking home along the shore of a lake, wet through, heads down against the wind, and they came upon the daffodils, first just a few at the water's edge, then more, and then a long wide belt of them running along the shore under the trees, thousands of them, more than either of them had ever seen gathered in one place. And Dorothy stopped and looked, and what she saw she carried home and wrote into her journal, and it is one of the loveliest passages she ever set down. I won't read you her exact words because they are hers, and because you deserve to come upon them yourself one day, on the page, in her own hand. But I will tell you what she saw, in my own way. She saw that the daffodils grew right among the mossy stones at the edge of the water. She saw that some of them, as if wearied, had laid their heads upon the stones, resting there as a tired person rests a cheek upon a pillow. And she saw that the great mass of them, caught in the wind coming off the lake, were tossing and wheeling and reeling, all of them moving together, and that they looked, truly looked, as though they were laughing. Not merely bending in the breeze, laughing, dancing with a wild, glad, living joy so full of life and gladness that a person watching couldn't help but feel their spirits lift. That is what Dorothy saw, and that is what Dorothy wrote, standing in her own two shoes in the wind, seeing with her own two eyes. 2 years passed, and then one day William, casting about for a subject, or perhaps simply remembering, took up that image, the dancing, laughing daffodils by the water, and made his poem. He kept the heart of what she'd seen, the crowd of flowers, the dancing, the joy. He added his own things, the cloud, the loneliness, the couch he lies upon in later years when the memory of the flowers comes back to comfort him. He shaped it into music and made it immortal. And it is a wonderful poem, and I wouldn't take a word of it away from him. But every time I read it, I think of Dorothy on that shore, 2 years before seeing the thing first, feeling the joy of it first, finding the words for it first, and then handing it, without a thought, without any sense that she was giving away something precious, to her brother, who would sign his name to it, and becomes up in part because of it, one of the most celebrated poets in the history of the language. And the daffodils were not the only case, not by a long way. Once you start looking, you find Dorothy's fingerprints all over her brother's work. There is a poem of his about a solitary bird, a nightingale singing in the dark, and behind it you can feel the nights the two of them spent listening to exactly such a bird from the cottage garden, Dorothy noting its song in her journal. There is his poem about the old leech gatherer, the bent man on the moor, and we know beyond doubt that the two of them met that man together on a walk, and that Dorothy wrote him down in her plain prose long before William turned him into a meditation on endurance and the human spirit. There is a whole cluster of small poems he wrote about flowers, the celandine, the daisy, the little unassuming blossoms of the hedgerow, and every one of them grows out of the ground Dorothy had already tended in her journal, where those same flowers appear again and again, watched and loved and named. He walked in a world she'd already seen for her poem, in a sense. She went ahead, with her open eyes, and gathered the things worth noticing, and laid them out, and he came behind and built the poems. I don't say this to diminish him. I want to be clear about that. Because it would be easy to hear all this as an attack on William, a settling of an old score on Dorothy's behalf. It isn't. William was the poet, and the poems are his achievements, and they are magnificent, and the shaping of raw seeing into deathless verse is a gift Dorothy didn't have and never claimed. What I am trying to describe is something stranger and more interesting than theft or credit. It is a genuine collaboration, so deep and so unself-conscious that neither of them, I think, ever fully separated their contributions in their own minds. They saw together. They lived inside the same shared attention to the world. And out of that shared seeing came the poems with William's name on them, because that was how the world worked, and neither of them thought to question it. And she never minded. That is the part I cannot get past. She never seems to have felt cheated, or overlooked or robbed. There is no bitterness in her journal, no note of resentment, no quiet complaint that the world praised him for seeing what she had seen first. She was proud of him. She rejoiced in his success. She copied out the poems that were built on her own vision, in her own hand, and sent them into the world under his name, and felt, as far as we can tell, nothing but gladness that his gift was being recognised. Think too about what it cost her, in the plainest practical terms, to make this life possible for him. A poet needs time. He needs long, empty, unhurried hours to walk and mutter and stare at nothing while the lines form. He needs someone to make sure there is bread on the table and a fire in the grate and clean shirts in the drawer, so that the whole fragile apparatus of his concentration isn't shattered every hour by the demands of ordinary life. That someone was Dorothy. Every hour William spent free to compose was an hour Dorothy had bought for him with her own labour, baking, mending, cleaning, managing, carrying the entire weight of the household so that his mind could float free above it. This is a thing that has happened to countless gifted women across history, that their gift was spent in clearing space for someone else's gift, and it is usually invisible, and it was very nearly invisible here. But Dorothy's journal makes it visible. You can watch her do it day by day. You can see in the record of her endless small labours the exact price that was paid by her so that the poems could exist. And you can see too that she paid it gladly, which is its own kind of greatness, harder to measure than the greatness of the poems, but no less real. There is one line in her journal though, one small, private, extraordinary line that opens a window into what she knew about herself. She wrote it after a walk, or an evening of looking at something beautiful, and it is almost an aside, almost nothing. She wrote that she felt herself to be almost, or more than, half a poet. That is all. Half a poet. She wouldn't claim the whole title. She left that for William. But she knew, quietly, privately, in the honest dark of her own journal, that something in her was of the same substance as the thing the world called poetry in her brother. She had the eye, she had the feeling, she had the words. She was more than half a poet and she knew it, and she wrote it down once to herself, and then she closed the book and went to make the supper. I want to sit with that line, because I think it holds the whole quiet tragedy and the whole quiet triumph of her life both at once. The tragedy is obvious. Here was a woman of rare and genuine gift who in another age, or another body, or another set of circumstances, might have written under her own name and been remembered for it. Instead, she poured her seeing into a private journal and into her brother's poems, and the world knew nothing of her for 100 years. That is a loss. It would be dishonest not to feel it as a loss. But the triumph is there too, and it is just as real, and I don't want to let the sadness swallow it. Because Dorothy, I think, wasn't a frustrated poet, eating her heart out over unwritten fame. She was something rarer, and perhaps happier. She was a person who loved the seeing itself, more than any reward the seeing might bring. She didn't write to be praised. She wrote because the world was beautiful, and she couldn't bear to let it pass unrecorded. The daffodils didn't belong to her, and they didn't belong to William. They belonged to the wind and the lake and the spring. All either of them could do was see them and love them and try to say what they were. William said it in a way that made him famous. Dorothy said it in a way that made her, for a century, invisible. But she said it first, and she said it truly. And I'm not at all sure that the fame was the better part of the bargain. Coleridge understood what she was. He was there often, the third of that little circle, walking the fells with the two of them, talking through the nights, and he saw Dorothy clearly, the quickness of her, the wildness of her perception, the way her eye caught things that other eyes slid past. He said of her once that she was a woman in whom the senses and the mind were exquisitely, almost dangerously alive, that she saw and felt everything, that her taste was a perfect electrometer, registering the finest movements of beauty in a way that both delighted and slightly frightened him. That is a poet's tribute to a poet, whether or not either of them would have used the word. Coleridge knew, William knew. The people closest to her knew exactly what she was. It was only the wider world and the record of history that left her out. It wasn't published in her lifetime, her journal. She never sought a reader beyond her brother and their small circle. For decades after her death, the notebook sat largely unregarded. And it was only much later, well over 100 years after she first walked into that cottage, that scholars and editors began to understand what they had, and to print her words, and to trace the lines that ran from her private pages into her brother's public poems. And when they did, something quietly remarkable happened. Readers who came to Dorothy expecting only the modest diary of a poet's sister found, instead, a writer of extraordinary power in her own right, whose prose was in some ways fresher and truer than the verse it had fed. Her daffodils, unrhymed, unshaped, set down for no one, turned out to be as alive on the page as her brother's famous stanzas, and to some readers even more so. The invisible woman in the back room had left, all along, a masterpiece of her own, hidden in plain sight inside the record of her ordinary days. She's at the table now, in the candlelight, copying out one of William's poems in her fair, sloping hand. Perhaps it is the daffodils. Perhaps she is writing down, in the neat script meant for the printer, the very image she first saw on that windy shore, now dressed in her brother's music and about to go out into the world under her brother's name. She doesn't pause over it. She doesn't sigh or resent or reflect on the strangeness of it. She simply copies, carefully, lovingly, getting every word right, because the poem matters and the work is hers to do. And when it is finished, she sets down the pen and trims the candle, and perhaps, before she sleeps, she opens her own journal and writes a line or two about the day, the weather, a flower, the colour of the sky, setting down once more for no one but herself the endless beauty of the world she was more than half a poet in seeing. There were the days when William was away, and those days have a different weather in the journal. The handwriting is the same. The bread still gets baked, the garden still gets watered, The walks still get walked, but something underneath has shifted, and if you read closely you can feel it, a kind of held breath running under the ordinary sentences, a waiting that colours everything. He went away often enough. To Yorkshire, to see the family they'd grown up around, to Penrith, to Keswick, to London on business that always took longer than it was meant to. Sometimes he was gone a few days, sometimes weeks, and Dorothy, who had spent her whole young life longing to be reunited with this brother, who had built her entire existence around the fact of living beside him at last, would be left in the small stone cottage with the fire and the flagstones and the lake, and the quiet would come down over the house like a lid. I want to be careful how I tell the sis, because it would be easy to make it sound sadder than it was. Dorothy wasn't a woman falling apart in an empty house. She was competent, occupied, deeply rooted in her own days. She had her work and her walks and her neighbours and her endless, inexhaustible looking. But there is something in these entries, in the long stretches when he was gone, that's more tender and more exposed than anything else she wrote, and I think it deserves our attention tonight, because it shows us what the cost of her devotion actually felt like from the inside. The first thing that happens, always, is the letters. The post in her time came to Ambleside, several miles down the road, and it came when it came, on no schedule you could rely on. So the whole business of hearing from William became a kind of pilgrimage. She'd walk to Ambleside several miles each way, over the road that wound between the stone walls and the hedgerows, to see whether anything had arrived. Sometimes she went in the morning, sometimes she went in the evening after the day's work was done. Sometimes, when the wanting was strong enough, she went twice, and so often, so very often, there was nothing. She records these empty trips with a restraint that breaks my heart a little. She walked to Ambleside, there was no letter. She walked home. That is frequently the whole of it. 3 flat sentences containing a 5 or 6 mile walk and a hope raised and dropped. But now and then the feeling leaks through the plainness. She writes once of walking back from the post office having found nothing, and of slowing her steps as she came near the house, deliberately slowing, because as long as she was still walking she could still imagine that a letter might be waiting at home, and the moment she got there and found none, the hope would be over for another day. So she walked slower. She stretched out the last quarter mile, holding on to the possibility as long as she could. I find that almost unbearably human. Any of us who've ever waited for word from someone we love knows exactly that instinct. The delaying of the moment when the not knowing turns into knowing, and the knowing is the worse of the two, and there is another entry from a different absence where the letter finally comes, and she is so glad that she can hardly hold still, and she reads it standing in the road, and then reads it again walking home, and then again by the fire, until she has the whole of it by heart. That is the other side of the waiting. When it ends, the relief is enormous, disproportionate. The whole grey house suddenly warm again because a folded piece of paper has arrived with familiar handwriting on it. In between, she managed herself. This is the part I most want you to see, because it is where her particular strength shows plainest. Dorothy knew from long experience that idleness and longing were a dangerous mixture, and that the way through an absence was to fill it. So she filled it. She set herself tasks deliberately, almost fiercely, and worked her way through them. She cleaned. Not the ordinary daily cleaning, but the deep, unnecessary, invented kind that a person reaches for when they need occupation. She turned out the drawers and put everything back in order. She took down 2 months of old newspapers, which had been accumulating in a heap, and sorted them, and arranged them properly by date. A job nobody had asked for and nobody would notice. She mended things that weren't quite broken. She sewed. She copied out poems. She wrote long letters to friends, to Coleridge, to Mary, to whoever would give her a reason to sit down with a pen and be busy. And she wrote in her journal more than usual, longer entries, more careful, as though the act of setting the day down were itself a companionship, which of course it was. She once wrote plainly that she meant to keep herself busy, that she wanted to make herself look well, and to be well when he came home, so that he should find her in good health and good spirits and not have to worry about her. There is a whole world in that sentence. She was managing her own loneliness on his behalf so that it wouldn't become a burden to him. She'd carry it silently and be cheerful and healthy at the door when he arrived. The small things she did while he was gone are the ones that stay with me. She went about the house gathering up his clothes, which he'd left strewn everywhere in the usual way of a man packing in a hurry, and she folded each piece and put it away, handling the shirts and the coats of an absent person, the way you do when the object is standing in for the man himself. And in one of the rooms she found an apple, half-eaten, that he'd bitten into and set down and forgotten before he left. She picked it up. It was going brown, of course, and it was rubbish, and there was nothing to do with it but throw it on the fire. And she stood there and found that she could hardly bear to do it. An apple with his teeth marks in it. The last physical trace of him in the house spoiling in her hand. She wrote it down, that hesitation, and in doing so she gave us the most exact picture of missing someone that I know of in the English language. Not a grand declaration. An apple she didn't want to burn. And there was another absence underneath the ordinary ones, quieter and further off, which she carried through all of these years. Their brother John, the sailor, was away at sea for long stretches, and Dorothy loved him too, in her wholehearted way, and worried about him constantly. The sea was a hard employer, and the ships of that age went down often, and every letter from John was a small reprieve, and every gap between letters a slow tightening. He'd stayed with them at the cottage once for months, and those had been among the happiest months of her life, the three of them together, John walking the fells with them and learning the names of the flowers from his sister. And then he'd gone back to his ship, as he always had to, and the waiting had started again. It's why the frightened sailor on the road undid her so completely, that stranger with John's face. She lived always, with somebody out on the water. That's the shape of a life built entirely on love, I think. You're only ever as settled as the people you love are safe, and they're never all safe at once. Dorothy had made her whole existence out of her attachments, having nothing else to make it from. No fortune, no husband, no position. And so her happiness was permanently hostage to the post. To the weather at sea, to whether a particular man came home when he said he would. She knew that. She'd chosen it, insofar as she had any choice at all. And she bore it with a steadiness that still astonishes me. The nights were long. She sat up by the fire far past any reasonable hour, sometimes until the stars had come fully out and the whole valley was silent, sometimes writing letters until the peat burned down and the cold began to come up out of the flagstones. She read. She sewed by candlelight, she listened to the wind, and when she did go up to bed she often couldn't sleep, and she'd lie awake in the dark listening to the house tick and settle around her. The neighbours helped, in the small unspoken ways of a close valley. Molly came in to do the heavy work and stayed to talk. Mrs. Simpson would send something down from the farm, or Dorothy would walk up there in the afternoon and sit a while in another woman's kitchen, and the two of them would talk about nothing much. The weather, the crops, who was ill, who was expecting, the small currency of village life. Old Mr. Simpson would call in of an evening and sit by the fire. People came to the door with eggs, with milk, with news, and Dorothy, who could be so solitary, took real comfort in all of it. She wasn't a hermit. She liked her neighbours, and they liked her, and our valley closed around her when she was on her own in the way that such places do, not making a fuss, simply making sure that the woman in the cottage at Town End had somebody's face to look at before the day was over. But the nights were still the nights, and there's no neighbour for those. When the last visitor had gone, and the door was shut and the fire had settled, the house grew very large around her. That's the thing about a small cottage. It's cosy when there are two of you in it, and cavernous when there's one. Every sound was hers alone to account for. The wind in the chimney, the beam creaking overhead as the timber cooled, a sheep on the road outside. She knew every one of those noises by heart, and they still filled the silence in a way that made her aware of exactly how much silence there was. There is one night in particular that I think about often. She had a letter that needed to go, urgently, and the way to send a letter in that country at that time was to carry it yourself to where the post could take it, and there was no waiting until morning. So Dorothy put on her cloak at 2 o'clock in the morning in the depth of winter and went out. Think about that for a moment. 2 in the morning, a woman alone in a valley with no lamps, no roads to speak of, nothing but the black shapes of the mountains against a sky full of stars, and miles to walk on frozen ground. She went. She walked the whole way and delivered the letter, and walked the whole way back. And she wrote afterwards that she'd never in her life felt such cold, that it went through everything she had on and into her bones and stayed there. And when she got home, the fire was long dead and she couldn't get warm again. She went to bed piling on every article of clothing she could find and lay there shaking, unable to even sleep, waiting for morning. She doesn't dramatise it. There's no self-pity in the entry, no reproach, no suggestion that anyone ought to have spared her the trip. She simply records the coldest night of her life the way she records the daffodils precisely, without comment, and moves on to the next day. But I sit with that image sometimes. The small figure on the frozen road at 2 a.m. under all those stars, walking miles in the dark to send a letter, and coming home to a cold hearth, and getting into bed with her clothes piled over her, and no warmth anywhere, and never once writing that it was unfair. And here is the thing I keep circling, the question underneath all of these entries. Was she lonely? Yes, plainly. She was lonely in a way that comes off the page even now, 200 years later. But loneliness wasn't the whole of what she was, and I think we do her a disservice if we let it be the headline. Because look at what else these solitary days contain. The garden still gets planted, the bread still gets baked, the walks still happen, and the seeing still happens, and the descriptions of the light and the water on the days when William was away are every bit as beautiful as the ones when he was home. She lies in the orchard alone and watches the birds. She walks to Rydal alone and watches the moon. She sits by the fire alone and reads Shakespeare. Her capacity for wonder didn't depend on having someone beside her to share it. She was fully alive whether or not anyone was watching, and that isn't a small thing. That is, in fact, one of the rarest things a person be. There is a particular kind of self-sufficiency in Dorothy that I find quietly instructive. She'd built out of very little a life that could hold her even at its emptiest. The valley was still there when he was gone, the flowers still came up, the work still needed doing, and she still did it, and found meaning in it, and wrote it down. She didn't need him in order to exist. She wanted him, which is different, and the wanting hurt, and she let it hurt, and she got on with the day. I think too about the shape her whole life had, and about what people would have said of her at the time. A woman in her 30s, unmarried, no prospects, living in her brother's house, keeping his home, without money or standing of her own. In the eyes of her age, that was a kind of failure. There was a word for a woman like that, and it wasn't a kind word, and the assumption behind it was that such a person had missed the only thing a woman's life was for, and was now simply filling in the years. That is what her society would have seen when it looked at Dorothy Wordsworth. A spinster, a dependent, someone who hadn't managed to get herself married, and was therefore, in the ledger of the age, a leftover. And I want to say as plainly as I can that her society was wrong. Not wrong in a comforting, sentimental way, but wrong on the facts. This woman lived one of the fullest lives of her entire generation. She saw more, felt more, noticed more, and left behind more of lasting value than the vast majority of the properly married, properly settled women whose names are now completely gone. She wasn't filling in the years. She was using them, every one, right down to the last hour of daylight. The society that pitied her has produced almost nothing that anyone still reads. The woman it pitied produced a book that people will be reading in another 200 years. The cottage in the evening then, with William away. The fire low, the letters written, the drawers tidied and the newspapers sorted, and the shirts folded and put away. She has walked to Ambleside and back, and there was nothing. And she has slowed her steps on the way home to keep the hope alive a few minutes longer. And now she is here, in the small warm room, with the candle and the journal and the whole enormous night outside. She writes the day down, what the sky did, what she planted, who came to the door, the half-eaten apple she couldn't throw on the fire. Then she closes the book and banks the fire and goes up the narrow stairs to a cold bed in an empty house, and she is alone, and she is all right. and outside the window the mountains stand in the dark exactly as they have stood for 10,000 years, keeping their patient watch over the small lit room and the woman inside it, who is waiting, and who is also, in her own quiet and unbreakable way, entirely complete. Autumn comes to the valley slowly, and then all at once. There is a week in September when nothing much seems to change. The grass still green, the trees still full, and then you look up one morning and the whole hillside has turned, and the year has tipped over into its ending. Dorothy watched this happen every single year of her life at Grasmere, and every year she wrote it down, and every year she found it new. She was a connoisseur of autumn-coupled colour, in a way I have never encountered in anyone else. Most of us, if we're honest, see autumn as a general wash of orange and gold. Dorothy saw it tree by tree. She noticed that in her own small orchard the pear tree had gone a brilliant yellow, while the apple trees beside it were still entirely green, the two of them standing side by side in completely different seasons. She noticed that the fern on the hillsides had turned a deep orange that lay between the oaks like a spread cloth, and that the oaks themselves hadn't yet begun to change, so that the whole fellside was a mixture of 2 years at once. She noticed the birches going a pale, almost translucent gold, and the ashes dropping their leaves while still green, and the way certain trees and certain lights seemed to be lit from inside rather than from the sky. And the mosses. I have to mention the mosses because they tell you everything about her. In the late autumn, when the flowers were gone and there was nothing much left to gather, Dorothy would go out and collect moss. Not for any practical purpose. She gathered the mosses she found on stones and fallen wood, the different greens and golds and rusts of them, and she brought them home in her apron, and she arranged them along the mantelpiece over the fire. She wrote once that she meant to make the chimney beautiful before her beloved came home. That was the whole reason. She was decorating a stone fireplace with wild moss, in a cottage nobody important would ever visit, so that a room would be lovely for a man arriving on a cold night. There's no practical value in that gesture whatsoever. It's pure, useless, unnecessary beauty, made from things she picked up off the ground, offered to someone she loved. And I think it may be the most Dorothy thing in the entire journal. There is a walk from that autumn that I want to take you on because it's one of my favourite things she ever wrote. She and William went up onto the fells one day, into the high, empty ground above the valley, and they came upon the ruins of a sheepfold. An old one, long abandoned. Just a circle of stones, tumbled and half buried in the turf, where some shepherd generations before had built a shelter for his flock and then gone away, or died and left it to fall. They stood and looked at it, and Dorothy, being Dorothy, looked at the shape of it, and she saw that the fallen circle of stones wasn't quite a circle. It had been pulled out of true by time and weather and the collapse of one side, so that what it now resembled, sitting there in the wet grass on that high lonely fell, was a heart. Not a neat one, not the tidy symmetrical shape you draw. A heart that was slightly wrong, uneven, one side larger than the other. She wrote that it was shaped like a heart, unequally divided. I can't tell you why that phrase has lodged in me the way it has. Perhaps because it's so exact. Perhaps because it's such a strange and beautiful thing to find on a mountainside. An accidental heart made of fallen stones, made by nobody, meaning nothing. Or perhaps because it seems, without her intending it in the least, to say something true about her own life. A heart, unequally divided, given away more than it was given to, larger on one side than the other, and still, unmistakably, a heart, still holding its shape after everything up there in the wind and the rain where nobody was watching. William would later build a poem out of that sheepfold too. Of course he would. But it was Dorothy who saw the heart. The apples came down in October, the whole crop of the little orchard, and Dorothy went up with a basket and gathered them, working her way along the branches, filling the basket and carrying it down and going back for more. It was a good year, or a poor one depending on the spring, and she noted which, because that mattered. The fruit went into store, laid out somewhere cool and dark where it would keep, and through the winter it would come out one by one to be eaten raw or baked into the tarts she loved. There is something in the rhythm of that, the growing and the gathering and the keeping and the eating, a whole year of a tree's work passing through one woman's hands and ending up on a plate in February, that we have almost entirely lost. Dorothy knew where every single thing on her table came from. She'd watched most of it grow. She'd picked it herself in most cases, off a branch or out of the ground within sight of her own front door. Her food had history that she had witnessed personally from beginning to end, and I suspect that made the eating of it a different experience altogether from the one we have now, and the garden had to be put to bed. The dead stalks cleared, the pea sticks pulled up and stacked, the last of the beans gathered, and the plants turned into the soil. She writes of these tasks with the same evenness she brings to everything. No lament for the end of the growing season, no complaint about the cold coming. The year had turned. The garden was going to sleep. It would wake again in March. She'd seen it happen enough times to trust it completely. The weather turns properly cold in November, and the journal turns with it. The entries fill with fires, with frost, with the mist coming down so low that the cottage seems to be floating in cloud. She writes of the first real frost, the grass stiff and white in the morning, the puddles on the road frozen into panes of grey glass that broke under her feet with a sound she noticed and recorded. She writes of the snow arriving on the tops of the mountains first, a white line laid across the fells while the valley below was still green, and then creeping down day by day until one morning it had reached the door, and the fire becomes the centre of everything again. The carts of coal come from Thomas Ashburner. The peat is stacked. The rotten boughs blown down in the autumn gales are gathered and carried home, and in the evenings the little cottage draws itself in around its hearth, the way it has done every winter for 100 years before Dorothy, and would do for 100 years after, and the light of the fire moves on the low ceiling, and the wind goes around the house looking for a way in. The days grow very short in that valley in December. The sun comes late over the fell and goes early behind the other one, and there are weeks when the whole floor of the valley never gets direct light at all, when the world is a kind of permanent blue dusk from breakfast to bed. You might think that would have crushed her. It didn't. She wrote about the winter light with as much attention as the summer light, the strange, low, sideways quality of it, the way a single shaft would find a gap in the hills and lay a bar of gold across the water for 10 minutes and then be gone. She noticed the stars, which are extraordinary in that country on a clear frozen night, when the whole sky comes down close. She noticed the shapes of the bare trees, which she seems to have loved almost more than the leafy ones, the fine black tracery of the branches against a grey sky, every twig distinct. That is a thing I want to name plainly, because it took me a long time to see it. Dorothy had no notion of a bad day. There were no wasted days in her calendar, no days she wrote off as too dark or too wet or too cold to be worth having. Every day was a day. Every day had light in it of some kind, and weather worth describing, and something growing or dying or holding on. She met each one on its own terms and asked it for nothing it could not give, and so she never ran out. 2.5 years of daily entries at Grasmere, and the well never runs dry because the world she was drawing from was inexhaustible, and she'd made herself the kind of person who could see that. There is a night from that winter I want to leave you with. It was late, very late and cold, and Dorothy and William were at home, and neither of them expected anything at all. And then there was a knock, and it was Coleridge. He'd walked over the mountains to reach them, over Helvellyn in the dark in winter, a crossing of high exposed ground in freezing weather, alone, at night, for no better reason than that he wanted to be with his friends. He arrived at their door out of the black cold, and they took him in and put him by the fire, and the three of them sat up talking until 3:30 in the morning. I love that so much. 3 people in a tiny stone room in the middle of a frozen valley, with one candle and a peat fire, talking about poetry and God and whatever else came into their heads, while outside the mountain stood in the snow and the whole rest of England slept. Dorothy wrote it down, the lateness of the hour, the fact of his crossing, the pleasure of the talk. She didn't say she was happy, she didn't need to. And there is a change coming that she does not write about directly, though you can feel it gathering at the edges of these later pages. William is going to marry. Mary Hutchinson, whom they have both known since childhood, whom Dorothy loves genuinely and without reservation, is going to come and live in this cottage, and the arrangement that has been the whole architecture of Dorothy's adult life is going to be rearranged around a third person. Dorothy welcomed it. She helped bring it about, she loved Mary and wanted the marriage and rejoiced in it. And she also, being human, must have felt the ground move under her, must have understood that the particular closeness of these Grasmere years, the two of them alone in the small house with the fire and the lake, was ending and would not come again. She wrote almost nothing about that. It's one of the great silences in the journal, but it's there underneath in the way she holds on so tightly to the ordinary details of those last months, as though she knew, without letting herself know, that she was writing down the end of something. I find that restraint extraordinary, and very like her. Another person would have filled pages with it. Dorothy set down the weather and the flowers, and went on. She kept her own counsel, even from her own journal, even in the dark, even at 2 a.m. by a dying peat fire. Whatever she felt about it, she folded up small and put away, the way she folded William's shirts, and got on with the day that was in front of her. And then the year turns, as years do. The snow comes and melts and comes again. February arrives, and Dorothy goes out and finds the snowdrops pushing up through the half-frozen ground, and she kneels down in the cold mud and transplants some of them into her own garden with her bare fingers, because in a few weeks she wants to be able to see them from the window. March comes, and the celandines open. April comes, and there are daffodils again, on the same shores, in the same wind, exactly as they were the year before, and exactly as they will be the year after. And Dorothy walks out to see them. Again, for the 10th time or the 20th, the same flowers on the same lake in the same April gale, and she looks at them with the same attention she gave them the first time, and finds something new to notice, and comes home and writes it down. That, in the end, is the shape of her life, not a line going somewhere, a circle turning, the seasons coming round and coming round, and the work going on, the bread, the mending the fire, the garden and the walking, always the walking, and the looking and the writing down. There's no plot to it. Nothing builds. Nothing culminates. She doesn't achieve anything in the sense the world means by achievement. She never publishes a book, never earns an income, never marries, never has a child, never leaves the small circle of hills that surrounds her. And I want to say clearly, at the end of all this, that I think she had one of the best lives anyone in her century managed to have. Because look at what she actually did with her days. She spent them awake. She spent them looking at the world with her whole heart, and loving the people in front of her, and making a small warm place out of stone and firelight, and putting moss on the mantelpiece to make the chimney beautiful. She wasn't waiting for her life to start. She wasn't saving herself for something better that never came. Every single day, from the first entry to the last, she was completely present in the day she actually had. That's the rarest thing in the world. Most of us never manage it for an hour. And here is what I keep coming back to, the thing that seems to me the whole quiet point of her. Dorothy Wordsworth had nothing that her society valued. No husband, no money, no property, no title, no fame, no name on any cover. By every measure her age used to score a woman's life, she came out at nothing. And she was all the while richer than nearly anyone alive. She had the lake and the moon and the daffodils. She had a brother she adored, and a fire she built with her own hands, and a valley. She knew the way you know a face. She had work that mattered, and a garden that grew, and an eye that never once in all those years stopped seeing. The measure was wrong. That is what she proves without ever arguing it, just by living. The measure was simply wrong. It's evening at the cottage. The last of the light is going off the lake, and the mountains have gone flat and black against a sky that still holds a little green in the west. Inside, the fire is banked, and the mosses sit along the mantelpiece where she put them, dark green and gold in the firelight. There's bread cooling on the table, there's mending in the basket for tomorrow. The The snowdrops she planted in February are up in the garden under the window, closed for the night. And at the table, in the small circle of candlelight, a woman sits with her journal open, writing down the day. The colour of the sky at 5:45. What she planted. Who came to the door. The sound of a sheep bell in a hollow. Exquisitely soothing. Very far away. She sets down her pen and wipes the nib and closes the book on another ordinary day that nobody but her would ever have thought worth keeping. Tomorrow she'll rise before the light and lay the fire and walk out into the valley and look at everything there is to look at and come home and write it down again exactly as she did today. And the year turns and the lake goes still and the mountains keep their watch and the small light in the window goes out. So that is where we leave her. In a small stone cottage at the edge of a lake, with the fire banked and the mosses on the mantelpiece and her journal closed on the table beside a candle that is nearly out. She's still there in a sense. Not the woman herself, of course. But the days she wrote down are still there, exactly as she set them, and anyone who opens that book can walk straight back into them. The sheep bell in the hollow, the lamb that came and stood beside her in the orchard, the half-eaten apple she couldn't bring herself to throw on the fire, the daffodils laughing in the wind by the water. 200 years, and they have not faded at all. And I keep thinking tonight about all the people who left nothing. The old man wading the cold ponds, the boy with the green leaves in his hat, the servant girl who couldn't believe her own good luck, the countless millions who lived and worked and loved and were forgotten completely because nobody happened to be watching. Almost every life that's ever been lived has gone that way. And then, once in a very long while, someone comes along who pays attention, and a few of those vanished people are handed back to us, still breathing, still themselves. That was Dorothy's gift, and it's a greater one than we usually admit. She had no power, no fortune, no platform. All she had was the willingness to look, carefully and kindly, at whatever was in front of her. And it turned out that was more than enough, which brings me, in a roundabout way, back to you lying there in the dark, because your life is made mostly of ordinary days too. Most of ours are. Dorothy's was made of exactly that and nothing else, and it was one of the richest of her century, not because of what happened in it, but because of how closely she looked at it. There's nothing you need to do about that tonight. But perhaps, some morning soon, there'll be a moment. The light on a wall, a bird outside a window, the steam coming off a cup, and you might find yourself looking a second longer than you meant to. That's all she ever did. That's the whole of it. If anything tonight stayed with you, a detail, a moment, something the story turned up in your own memory, I'd love to hear about it. If you feel like it, leave a few words below. There is no hurry. It can wait until morning. And a word about this channel. Oh. If you'll allow me, what we're doing here is simple. We want to sit with the ordinary past. Not the battles and the kings, but the kitchens and the gardens and the long, quiet afternoons. The parts of history nobody bothered to record because they seem too dull to matter. Medieval halls, Victorian sculleries, ancient streets at dusk, small stone cottages beside northern lakes. We'll keep going slowly one evening at a time for as long as you'd like to come along. If you'd care to follow, we'd be glad of your company. Thank you for spending this evening with her, and with me. It means more than I can easily say. The fire is out now, the lake is still. The mountains are keeping their watch over the valley, the way they always have, the way they always will, whether anyone is awake to see it or not. There is nothing left to do tonight. Sleep well.